Comrades, there is a truth that the ruling class trembles to hear, a truth so simple, so devastating, that it overturns the entire logic of the world you were born into. The value you create is greater than the life you are allowed to live. From the sweat of your labor springs the wealth of nations, yet you stand at the edge of survival. From your hands flow the abundance of society, yet your own cupboards remain bare. You build a world you are forbidden to enjoy. This contradiction is not an accident. It is the engine of capitalism. The system you inhabit elevates profit above humanity, property above life, and capital above the worker whose labor gives it form. You are told that scarcity is natural, that inequality is inevitable, that the ones who command you owe their fortunes to genius or divine blessing. But look more closely, look with the eyes of history, the eyes through which truth finally becomes visible. Every palace is built on the exhaustion of those who will never enter it. Every machine that multiplies, production multiplies also the distance between what you create and what you receive. Every hour of labor enriches someone who did not labor at all. This is the central contradiction Marx revealed. The worker produces value, but the capitalist appropriates it. The wealth you generate is seized before it ever returns to you. You are paid not according to what you contribute, but according to what is required to keep you alive just long enough to work again tomorrow. Your poverty is not a misfortune, it is a design. Your struggle is not individual, it is systemic. Your suffering is not a failure, it is a resource extracted for profit. The ruling class maintains its power not merely through economic ownership, but through ideological domination. They teach you to see competition where solidarity should stand. They train you to blame yourself for conditions engineered above you. They make you believe that freedom means choosing between employers who profit from your dispossession. They teach you that exploitation is opportunity, obedience is virtue, and endurance is strength. But exploitation is not a misunderstanding, it is the cornerstone of their world. Comrades, when Marx wrote that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, he was not describing a distant past. He was describing this moment, your moment. The antagonism between labor and capital has reached its highest pitch. The system demands more productivity, more efficiency, more sacrifice, while giving you less stability, less dignity, less life. You are praised as essential and treated as expendable. You are promised mobility and given chains disguised as choices. Yet understand this, the system survives only because you accept its definitions, its myths, its limits. It endures only because those who create all wealth have not yet recognized their collective power to reclaim it. Every worker, every oppressed person, every creator of value lives in conditions far beneath the richness they produce. But the moment the working class becomes conscious of this gap, not as a personal grievance, but as a structural theft, the entire edifice of exploitation trembles. When you see that your suffering is shared, that your struggle is universal, that your fate is bound to the fate of millions, then unity ceases to be a dream and becomes a historical force. The ruling class fears this awakening more than any revolution of machines or markets. Machines increase production. A conscious working class threatens their very existence. That is why they seek to divide you by nationality, by race, by gender, by sector, by contract, by status, anything to keep you from discovering that you already possess the power they pretend to hold. Comrades, the moment has come to lift the veil. You create the world. You move the factories, the fields, the offices, the networks, the systems. Without your labor, nothing functions. Without their ownership, everything still could. Your power is not potential, it is real, present, latent, waiting only for unity and direction. The task of history is not to plead for reforms that dull the edge of exploitation, it is to transform society at its roots. The emancipation of the working class requires the abolition of the conditions that produce exploitation. It requires the collective control of production by those who labor, the end of a world where the many create wealth for the few, and the birth of a society where value returns to those who generate it. Comrades, the life you are allowed to live is a shadow of the life you deserve. The system offers survival, you create abundance. It offers wages, you generate value. It offers discipline, you embody potential. It offers obedience, you hold the power to reshape the world. The time has come to claim what has always been yours. Rise with clarity. Rise with unity. Rise with the knowledge that the value you create is greater than the life you are permitted to live, and that only through collective struggle will you reclaim the world your labor has built. The workers create far more value than they ever receive under capitalism because the entire structure of the system is built upon extracting the difference between what labor produces and what labor is paid. This difference, which Marx called surplus value, is the hidden engine that drives profit, growth, and the accumulation of wealth in the hands of those who do not perform the labor themselves. When a worker steps into a factory, an office, a field, or a warehouse, they generate value through their physical and mental effort, value that materializes in commodities, services, systems, and processes. Yet what they receive in return is only a fraction of what they create, precisely calibrated to sustain their ability to continue working, but never enough to allow them to accumulate power or independence. This unequal exchange appears natural only because society has been conditioned to accept it as inevitable, even moral, when in reality it is the most fundamental injustice of economic life under capitalism. The worker sells their labor power for a wage because they must survive. But the wage is not tied to the true worth of what they produce. Instead, it is set according to the needs of the market, the pressure of competition, and the strategic interest of capital to minimize its costs. The worker may produce in 1 hour more value than their wage covers in an entire day, yet the excess does not return to them. It flows upward to owners, shareholders, executives, and financial institutions, who claim the fruits of labor without contributing to its creation. They justify this arrangement through the concepts of risk, management, or investment, but the explanations distract from the central fact that labor alone generates new value, and capital merely captures it after the fact. Every profit margin, every dividend, every company surplus is built upon the unpaid portion of the worker's effort, the invisible theft that is normalized through contracts and disguised as opportunity. This gap between value created and value received reveals itself everywhere, once one chooses to see it. The worker in a factory may produce goods worth thousands, yet receive a wage barely sufficient to cover rent and food. The teacher educates future workers, thinkers, and creators, yet struggles to meet basic expenses while institutions profit from the systems her labor sustains. The delivery driver transports commodities essential to the flow of the economy, yet sees only a sliver of the revenue those deliveries generate. The software engineer builds platforms worth billions, yet the immense wealth produced by her code is captured by investors and executives whose compensation rests on the labor of hundreds. In each case, labor creates the value, but capital appropriates it, reinforcing a hierarchy where those who contribute the least economically often reap the most financially. Capitalism justifies this imbalance through ideological narratives that claim workers are paid according to skill, merit, or market demand. But these explanations conceal more than they reveal. Skill is rewarded unevenly not because of inherent economic logic, but because of the strategic interests of capital in maintaining divisions within labor. Merit is a story told to turn systemic exploitation into individual competition. Market demand is shaped by the very people who benefit from suppressing wages and maximizing surplus. The truth is that wages are not a measure of value but a measure of power, and workers have less power because the system is structured to keep them fragmented, overworked, and dependent on the very forces that exploit them. The vast difference between value created and value received is also what fuels the immense concentration of wealth at the top. Billionaires do not accumulate fortunes through personal brilliance or extraordinary effort. They accumulate because millions of people work for them, generating value they do not get to keep. Every fortune is the collected surplus of thousands of workers over thousands of hours, transformed into private wealth through ownership and property laws. This inequality is not a distortion of capitalism, but its intended result, the logical outcome of a system where labor is commodified and value is measured not by contribution but by ownership. When workers begin to understand that the wealth of society originates in their hands, their minds, and their collective effort, they also begin to see that the limitations imposed on their lives are not natural but constructed. They see that their struggles are not personal failures but systemic constraints, designed to preserve the power of those who live off the surplus. They see that the life they are allowed to live is restricted precisely because the value they produce is taken from them, leaving them with only enough to return to work and repeat the cycle. Through this clarity, the myth of fair exchange crumbles, revealing a world built upon the continuous extraction of labor's richness. And the continuous denial of labor's rightful share. Exploitation is not accidental. It is the foundation of the capitalist system, because capitalism depends on a structural relationship in which those who own the means of production extract surplus from those who must sell their labor to survive. This extraction is not the result of corruption, mismanagement, or moral failure. It is the inner logic of the system itself. The worker enters the labor market without property and without control over production, compelled to sell labor power in exchange for a wage. But the wage is always less than the value produced, because if the worker were paid the full value of their labor, profit would vanish and the system would collapse. Thus, exploitation is not a side effect, but the mechanism through which capital expands, accumulates, and reproduces itself across generations. Capitalism functions through the transformation of human labor into a commodity, something bought and sold like any other input in the production process. But unlike machines or raw materials, labor has the unique capacity to create new value. It can generate more value than it costs to sustain. This gap between the cost of labor and the value it produces is surplus value, and it is this surplus that capital appropriates as profit. The owners of factories, corporations, logistics networks, agricultural estates, and digital platforms rely on this process to accumulate wealth. Their profits do not originate from their own labor or creativity, but from the portion of the worker's productivity that is unpaid. In this sense, exploitation is embedded in every transaction, every workday, every wage, and every profit report. It is the structural heartbeat of the system. The capitalist class insists that exploitation is voluntary because workers choose employment. But this ignores the fundamental coercion created by economic necessity. A worker does not freely choose to sell labor power. They must do so to survive. Without ownership of productive assets, without access to land, tools, or capital, the worker faces a choice between employment or destitution. This condition is not natural but historically produced through process that separated people from their means of subsistence, enclosure, colonial dispossession, debt systems, privatization, and legal frameworks that secure private property above all else. The worker's dependence on the wage is therefore the condition that makes exploitation possible and continuous. Exploitation shows itself not only in the wage relation, but in the constant pressure to extract more labor in less time. Workers are pushed to increase productivity, tolerate longer hours, maintain speed, and endure intensifying demands while receiving no proportional increase in compensation. Technological advancements, rather than liberating workers from toil, become instruments for deepening exploitation by enabling employers to monitor, measure, and control labor with unprecedented precision. Machines do not eliminate exploitation. They magnify it by reducing the cost of labor, raising expectations, and expanding the rate at which surplus can be extracted. Efficiency becomes a weapon wielded against the worker, not a shared benefit of collective progress. Capitalism also conceals exploitation beneath layers of ideology that present it as natural, meritocratic, and inevitable. Society is taught that profit comes from innovation, risk-taking, or managerial skill, masking the reality that profit originates in the unpaid portion of labor. Workers are encouraged to admire the wealthy as visionaries and job creators, rather than recognizing that their fortunes rest upon the exploitation of thousands or millions of people whose labor makes their wealth possible. By disguising exploitation as fairness or opportunity, the system protects itself from scrutiny and resistance. The language of freedom, entrepreneurship, and competition becomes a cloak that hides the true relations of power. Exploitation extends beyond economic inequality It shapes every aspect of life. It determines the quality of housing people can afford, the healthcare they receive, the food they eat, the education available to their children, and the leisure time they are permitted. It creates a world where workers produce abundance but remain trapped in scarcity, where they build wealth they cannot enjoy, where they generate value they do not control. Their exhaustion becomes the fuel for corporate expansion, while their insecurity becomes a tool to discipline them. The constant threat of unemployment, poverty, and replacement keeps workers compliant, not because the system is fair, but because it is designed to make alternatives impossible. The global nature of capitalism amplifies exploitation on a planetary scale. Supply chains stretch across continents to find cheaper labor, weaker regulations, and more vulnerable populations. Workers in factories, farms, and mines around the world endure harsh conditions to produce goods consumed far away, earning only a fraction of the wealth they generate. Their exploitation is justified through the language of development and progress, but it is driven by the same fundamental logic: the extraction of surplus value from labor. The interconnectedness of the global economy means exploitation is no longer confined to a single nation. It is embedded in international relations, trade agreements, and corporate strategies. To understand capitalism without acknowledging exploitation is to misunderstand it entirely. Profit, competition, accumulation, and growth all rely on the continuous extraction of surplus from labor. The system cannot function without it. Exploitation is not a flaw to be corrected through policy or reform. It is the mechanism through which the system sustains itself, expands its reach, and concentrates power in the hands of those who own rather than those who produce. Only by recognizing exploitation as the core of capitalism can workers begin to see that their struggles are not isolated, their suffering is not personal, and their power lies in challenging the very structure that depends on their subordination. The ruling class maintains power through ideology, division, and control of production, because these three forces create a system in which the majority not only labors for the minority but also accepts, rationalizes, or remains unaware of the mechanisms of their own subordination. Ideology shapes consciousness before people ever question their surroundings. It teaches them to see inequality as natural, competition as destiny, wealth as earned, and poverty as a personal failing rather than a structural outcome. From early childhood, individuals are immersed in narratives produced by institutions, controlled or influenced by the ruling class, schools that praise obedience, and discipline, media that glorifies wealth and individual success, government that enforce property relations, and cultural norms that uphold hierarchy. These institutions reproduce beliefs that stabilize the system. They make exploitation invisible by presenting it as the ordinary functioning of society. They direct anger away from the wealthy and toward other workers, immigrants, marginalized groups, or even the workers themselves. Ideology becomes a force more powerful than law because it controls not just action but perception. Division is another essential tool because a unified working class is the only real threat to the ruling elite. Division fragments the majority into competing groups so they cannot recognize their shared interests. The ruling class cultivates divisions based on nationality, race, religion, gender, region, profession, income, and even workplace roles. Each division becomes a barrier to collective consciousness. Workers are encouraged to see one another as rivals rather than allies. Nationalism pits workers of different countries against each other, even though their exploitation stems from the same global system. Racism isolates groups within a single society, creating hierarchies that benefit employers by justifying low wages, harsher conditions, and weakened solidarity. Gender inequality forces women into undervalued labor and unpaid domestic work that sustains the system while reducing their bargaining power. Professional hierarchies create illusions of superiority among workers, fostering competition instead of unity. Division permeates everyday life, ensuring that workers focus on differences. The ruling class quietly accumulates wealth from their collective labor. Control of production is perhaps the most direct and material foundation of ruling class power. Those who own factories, land, technology, infrastructure, and capital determine not only what is produced but how, where, and under what conditions production occurs. Ownership gives them command over the labor process itself. They decide who works, who is fired, who receives wages, and who remains in precarity. They determine the pace of work, the level of intensity, the wage structure, the introduction of machinery, the use of surveillance, and the conditions that shape workers' daily lives. Because workers depend on wages to survive, control of production becomes control over life. The ruling class uses this power to extract maximum productivity while minimizing costs. They enforce discipline not merely through rules but through economic necessity, transforming survival into a tool of obedience. Workers internalize the fear of unemployment, knowing that refusal or resistance often means losing the means to live. The ruling class also controls production by shaping the technologies that define the workplace. Automation, digital monitoring, algorithmic management, and surveillance systems are developed not primarily to improve life but to increase efficiency, reduce labor costs, and restrict workers' autonomy. Technology becomes an extension of ruling class power, restructuring labor in ways that deepen dependency. Even innovation is directed toward profit rather than human need. Entire industries rise and fall based on profitability, not social benefit. This means the ruling class can shape the structure of the economy itself, deciding which sectors grow, which collapse, and which forms of labor are valued or discarded. Ideology, division, and production are interwoven. Ideology justifies the control of production by framing owners as natural leaders, economic saviors. Division prevents workers from realizing that control of production is the source of their exploitation. Production, in turn, creates the conditions that reinforce ideological beliefs and deepen division. Together, these forces reproduce the dominance of the ruling class generation after generation. Children born into wealth inherit not only material capital, but the institutional and ideological advantages that maintain their position. Children born into working-class families inherit precarity, limited opportunities, and the narratives that normalize their struggle. The ruling class maintains power because the system is designed to sustain their dominance through every aspect of life. It shapes consciousness, dictates material conditions, and influences social relations. Workers rarely see the total structure because they are embedded within it, focused on daily survival, competing with one another and absorbing the ideological messages that obscure the true nature of exploitation. But once workers begin to see how ideology distorts perception, how division weakens solidarity, and how control of production underpins the entire hierarchy, the power of the ruling class becomes visible and fragile. The system relies on the majority believing the minority's authority is legitimate. When that belief erodes, the foundation of ruling class power begins to crack. True power emerges when workers recognize their shared conditions and unite because the force that sustains capitalism is not the strength of the ruling class, but the fragmentation of the working majority. As long as workers perceive their struggles as isolated, personal, or unrelated to the experience of others, they remain confined within the narrow boundaries that the system sets for them. Each worker feels the weight of exploitation, but alone it appears as a private burden, a matter of individual hardship, misfortune, or lack of opportunity. The system thrives on this separation, encouraging workers to see their conditions as normal or inevitable rather than as symptoms of a broader structure imposed upon them. Yet the moment workers begin to see their lives not as isolated events but as interconnected results of the same economic framework, the illusion of individual struggle dissolves, and the possibility of collective strength begins to take form. Recognition is the first act of power because it transforms personal suffering into political understanding. When workers compare their wages, share their stories, experience the same pressures from employers, and observe the same patterns of exploitation across different industries and regions, they begin to understand that they are not alone. The same forces shape the conditions of factory workers, miners, teachers, nurses, drivers, coders, and service workers. Long hours, rising costs of living, precarious contracts, stagnant wages, and the constant threat of unemployment are not unique miseries but universal features of the system. Once this shared reality becomes visible, workers no longer see each other as competitors or strangers, but as comrades bound by common interests. The recognition of shared exploitation is the beginning of consciousness, and consciousness is the seed from which collective power grows. Unity transforms this consciousness into action. When workers act as individuals, they have little leverage against the vast machinery of capital. Employers can replace one worker, discipline another, or fire a handful without disrupting their operation. But when workers come together, they create a force that capital cannot easily ignore. A strike by one worker is a risk. A strike by thousands is a crisis. A demand voiced by a single worker is a complaint. The same demand voiced by an entire workforce becomes a negotiation. Unity turns vulnerability into strength because it aligns the power of numbers against the concentrated power of ownership. Workers produce the wealth of society, and when they withdraw their labor, collectively, they reveal how dependent the system is upon them. The act of uniting also dissolves the divisions that the ruling class carefully cultivates. When workers recognize their shared conditions, the artificial borders of race, nationality, gender, and profession begin to fade. They see that the same system exploits workers in every country, the same logic suppresses wage across industries, the same structures restrict mobility and opportunity regardless of identity. Unity is not merely the gathering of individuals, but the dismantling of barriers that have long separated them. It is the realization that the interests of workers in one region are tied to the interests of workers everywhere, that solidarity across boundaries is not idealistic but necessary. Division weakens labor, unity strengthens it by expanding the scope of collective struggle beyond the limits imposed by the ruling class. When workers unite, they not only gain the power to resist, but also the ability to imagine alternatives. Collective struggle opens the mind to the possibility of systems not built on exploitation. As workers organize, debate, plan, and take action, they develop political awareness, strategic skill, and a vision for social transformation. They begin to understand that the world they inhabit is neither natural nor unchangeable, but created through human decisions and maintained by social arrangements that can be dismantled. Unity gives workers the power to challenge not only the immediate condition of their labor, but the entire structure of ownership and control. It allows them to move beyond demands for small improvements and toward the pursuit of fundamental change. True power does not come from the institutions of the ruling class or the laws they write, but from the collective will of the working majority. When workers unite, they create a force capable of halting production, reshaping political structure, and reorganizing society according to the needs of the many rather than the profits of the few. Their unity becomes a counterweight to the power of capital, not because they own wealth, but because they create it. Every factory, farm, office, hospital, and port relies on their labor. Every shipment, every service, every technological system depends on their participation. The ruling class appears powerful only as long as workers remain divided. Once united, the workers reveal themselves as the true engine of society. The realization that power belongs to the collective rather than the individual marks the beginning of social transformation. When workers recognize their shared conditions and unite, they unlock the capacity to assert their interests, reclaim control over their labor, and challenge the structures that confine them. Unity does not merely strengthen resistance, it redefines what is possible. Real liberation requires transforming the system, not reforming it, because the structures that create inequality, exploitation, and oppression cannot be modified into justice. They must be dismantled and rebuilt on entirely different foundations. Reform assumes that the system's core is sound, and only its excesses need correcting. But capitalism's injustices do not arise from mistakes, corruption, or policy flaws. They arise from the very logic that governs the system, the pursuit of profit above human need, the ownership of production by a minority, and the reduction of human life to labor power and consumer capacity. Reforms may soften immediate suffering, but they do not touch the mechanisms that generate suffering in the first place. A slightly higher wage does not alter the wage system. A new regulation does not end exploitation. An expanded welfare program does not change who controls the wealth of society. Reforms heal symptoms while leaving the disease intact. Liberation demands transformation because the system organizes society around private ownership of production. And as long as that ownership remains concentrated, the ruling class maintains control over the conditions of life for the majority. They decide what is produced, how it is produced, who benefits, and who remains expendable. No reform can reverse this imbalance because reforms do not shift ownership. They do not change who holds power over the workplace, the economy, and the political institutions that enforce property relations. Even when reforms seem beneficial, minimum wage increases, workplace protections, healthcare programs, they are designed to preserve the system by alleviating pressure just enough to prevent unrest. They stabilize exploitation rather than abolish it. They provide relief without altering the underlying relations of power. History shows that every major reform under capitalism has been a response to pressure from below, not generosity from above. When workers organize, strike, and demand change, the ruling class offers reforms to divert revolutionary energy and maintain control. Once the pressure subsides, these reforms are weakened, rolled back, or rendered ineffective through loopholes and enforcement failures. The system adapts to protect itself. It absorbs reforms, reconfigures them, and continues its central function, extracting surplus from labor and concentrating wealth. This cycle demonstrates that reform is not a path to liberation, but a tool the ruling class uses to prolong its dominance. True liberation requires a transformation of social relations, beginning with the abolition of private ownership of the means of production. This does not mean the end of personal property or individual autonomy. It means ending a system where a small minority controls the productive forces that shape the lives of millions. Transformation means workers collectively controlling workplaces, communities directing resources according to social needs, and economic decisions being made democratically rather than dictated by profit. Only when those who produce the wealth of society control it can exploitation end. Without changing ownership, any talk of liberation remains symbolic and incomplete. Reformists argue that gradual change is safer and more realistic, but gradualism preserves the very structures that must be uprooted. It teaches patience to those who are suffering now, obedience to those who are exploited daily, and trust in institutions designed to protect capital, not people. Gradual reform becomes a pacification strategy, encouraging workers to wait for incremental progress while the ruling class continues to accumulate power. Liberation cannot be achieved through slow concessions because the system regenerates its inequalities faster than reforms can address them. A society cannot be liberated while the mechanisms of exploitation remain intact. Transformation demands the development of new political, economic, and social forms that break from the logic of profit and embrace the logic of human need. It requires democratizing economic life so that production serves the collective good rather than private accumulation. It means reorganizing labor so that workers control their conditions instead of submitting to the dictates of owners. It means reshaping political institutions so they represent the working majority rather than the entrenched interest of capital. It means dismantling the ideological apparatus that justifies inequality and constructing new cultural frameworks grounded in solidarity, cooperation, and collective responsibility. Liberation also requires confronting the global nature of capitalism. Exploitation is not confined within national borders. It is embedded in supply chains, international finance, and geopolitical power. A transformed society cannot exist in isolation while the global capitalist system continues to dominate the world economy. True liberation requires movements that transcend borders, forge alliances between workers everywhere, and challenge the imperial structures that sustain global inequality. Reform within one country cannot alter a system that operates across continents. Transformation is not a single event, but a continuous process of reshaping institutions, consciousness, and social relations. It begins when workers understand that their struggle does not revolve around improving their position within the system, but overcoming the system itself. Liberation emerges when people refuse to accept the limitations imposed by capitalist logic and instead envision a world where human life is valued more highly than profit. Reform adjusts the chains. Transformation breaks them. In the end, everything returns to a single truth. The world in which we live is not inevitable, and the life the worker is allowed to live is not the life they deserve. The value created by millions is seized by a handful. Exploitation is woven into every structure of the system. The ruling class maintains its dominance by shaping consciousness and dividing the very people who keep society alive, and the power that could overturn this order lies dormant only because workers have not yet fully recognized their collective strength. Liberation cannot come from polishing the chains or patching the wounds inflicted by capitalism. It comes only when those who create the wealth of the world decide they will no longer surrender it. When workers understand their shared reality, when they unite across every imposed division, when they see that reform only sustains the structures that oppress them, they discover a power capable of reshaping society itself. The task is not to beg for fairness, but to claim what has always belonged to the workers, the right to control their labor, their lives, and the future of the world they build with their own hands.